You're listening the Virtual CISO Podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. With you, as always, your host, John Verry. And with me today is Chris Schaeffer. Hey, Chris.
How's it going, John?
It is going well. Looking forward to this conversation. So always start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day.
Yeah. So my name is Chris Schaeffer. I'm a managing director here at CBiz. Most recently with Markham and Markham Risk Advisory Services. I've been in the industry with Markham and its previous firm for about 10 years now. And in 2016, I joined us to the HITRUST third-party assessor program. And we've been a HITRUST third-party assessor ever since. And looking forward to discussing HITRUST and where it's going and who they are and how we could potentially help.
Absolutely. Before we get down to business, I always ask, what's your drink of choice?
Drink of choice, bourbon, and probably right now Buffalo Trace and Blanton's if I can find it available.
Very good. And you're not going to go wrong with that tree, right? Which ends in Pappy if you take that same mash and go far enough along. But of course, finding Pappy these days gets a little bit crazy.
Well, even more, I heard that the flooding a couple of weeks ago hit the distillery. I saw some pictures of that, and interestingly enough, we actually did a team outing in Lexington about 5-6 years ago, and we visited that distillery and a few others in the area. It was a great time.
Better that it hits the distillery than one of the rick houses. Right. Because we won't know about this for another 9 years, and who the heck knows, who's going to be here in 9 years, right? I mean,
They wouldn't.
Although if you're drinking Buffalo Trace, that's a younger bourbon. I mean, I drink Knob Creek, which is 9 years, so I don't need to worry about anything going on now.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't tell us where the Pappy and the Blanton's barrels were. Everybody asked, but I don't even think a lot of people know. I saw that Netflix documentary a couple.
About the bourbon ice. Yeah, that was crazy. That was crazy. All right, so like you alluded to, you do lots of things attestation oriented, but HITRUST is the thing that we're here to talk about today. So let's just set the floor, if you will. What exactly is HITRUST?
Yeah, so HITRUST was originally a nonprofit organization. I think they were founded in the late 2000s, 2007, if I remember correctly. Originally known as the HITRUST Information Trust Alliance, and really geared towards helping healthcare organizations and the providers demonstrate security and compliance in a consistent manner through their CSF or Common Security Framework. However, in version 19, and I think we're going to touch on this in a little bit, they kind of moved to be more of an industry agnostic approach with version 9. But now they've moved into AI controls and security assessments as well, and we can talk about that in a little bit. This year, I think it was March, they partnered with an investment firm to fuel their continued growth and focus on their core offerings and meeting the needs of the marketplace as well.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for them. Back in the very beginning, a guy by the name of Brian Klein authored the first SCF. Mm-hmm. And Brian at the time was working at a children's hospital in Philadelphia. He'd just come out of the military. He had a military background, and I used to go to have lunch with him. And like we would talk about it, and he would pick my brain about how to say things in an ISO way as opposed to a NIST, DISA, FISMA kind of way. So it's been around a while, that for sure. So there's two pieces, if you will, two core components of HITRUST that if somebody is talking about HITRUST, you need to know a bit about the CSF and my CSF. So talk about what those are.
So the CSF is really it's at the core of their offering. It's their framework that they use for all of their offerings, whether it's, the different assessment types they have now, their new AI certification. And it's unique because it brings in a lot of authoritative sources, and you can get insight reports such as HIPAA, NIST, ISO, PCI DSS. And it tends to be a little bit more threat adaptive than in a lot of the other frameworks because it's updated more frequently and usually no less than annually. And you go through the assessment requires their MyCSF portal tool. And this is available with a subscription. It's required for any validated assessment or certification that an organization would undergo. And it allows you to create an assessment object, which is the list of requirements that would be applicable to that organization and their goals, as well as insight reporting. It has different reporting to measure your maturity, as well as corrective action plan management on an ongoing basis if you choose to use it for that. So it's a great tool. It's come a long way in the 9 years that I've been using it. Version 2, I think they launched their own. Prior to that, I believe it was built on RSAM. But it's a tool. They continually to evolve it every time I log in. I see a new feature and something new and different. They continue to evolve it to meet the needs of the organizations and marketplace.
If I was going to oversimplify it, right, you can think of the CSF as being the list of controls that you may need to implement. So sort of a comparable to the clauses in Annex A of ISO 27001 or the trust services criteria of SOC 2. And then I guess you could compare the MyCSF to a good GRC tool, right? Governance risk and compliance tool, with the difference being that in this particular case, right, it's how you interact with it, and it helps you figure out which controls you need based on risk and context. And then it's also integral to that self-assessment and or third-party assessment process, correct?
Correct. I couldn't say it better myself.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you want to ask me the next question and I'll answer it? Kidding. I know. There's some answers that I could answer myself, but there's a lot I couldn't. So, so let's get into, and just to kind of also frame this, right? HITRUST is another, I'm going to call it both security framework and attestation framework, right?
Correct.
I mean, the focus of it is like ISO or SOC 2 is for organizations to be able to demonstrate the maturity of their cybersecurity program to a third party.
Exactly. And there are some key differences, which we can talk about in a bit, because it's not a one size fits all, whereas like the PCI DSS, assuming you're not a merchant with an SAQ, there's a finite on the DSS, whereas how you implement a SOC 2 might be different than another organization. So it does bring some continuity and structure to that. But yes, it is it's the base framework which all assessments are performed, and there's some options with the E1, I1, R2, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
So I was just going to ask you, so go right there, right? You have those three basic levels now. Used to be what it was, just an assessment or a validated self-assessment validated, and then they moved to this 3-tier model. Can you explain the 3-tier model?
So I think it was 2003, with the launch of version 11, they made some different offerings, because in prior years, HITRUST had it was known to be very difficult with what is now the R2, which was the only assessment prior to version 2023. And the E1 assessment, which is really essentials, cybersecurity hygiene, it's only 44 requirements, but it hits on all the major points that most organizations who deal with sensitive information, whether that's healthcare information or client information, should be doing. And it's a good starting point. We've seen a large ramp up in organizations that want to be HITRUST certified, start with that, and then either continue with that or then move on to the next option, which would be the I1. And that's really it's best practices over a broad range of threats. Cool thing with that is it's implementation only. So when we talk about the R2, which is the big one, it's built upon the Prisma maturity model. So you have to have a policy, for each requirement. You have to have a procedure that somebody could implement that policy with. And then you obviously have to implement that and operate it over a given period of time. With the I1, it's just implementation. So one of those requirements might be your business continuity plan or information security management program, which is a policy and procedure. But you're not having to write unique policies and procedures for each of those 182 in the I1 requirements. So it's a good stepping stone between the E1 to the I1. The I1's kind of comparable to most SOC 2s. The end goal for a lot of organizations is the R2, and that R2, as I mentioned, is built upon the Prisma model. So you have to have a policy, you have to have a procedure, and you have to have implementation. those are the minimum required for certification. Then there's also, how do you measure your effectiveness of actually implementing that as an organization? So you're monitoring controls to make sure that those things are actually happening. And then how do you manage any exceptions to make sure that, you improve the process overall? The latter two are less common. A lot of organizations, have measured and managed in certain areas, but certainly not across every requirement, as they'd be spending a lot of time measuring and monitoring rather than implementing for a lot of organizations. Difference with, the E1 versus the I1 and R2. The E1 is an annual assessment, has to be done every year. Whereas the I1, recently, I think it was late last year, they implemented what's called a rapid reassessment or a rapid recertification. And this is where the assessor will come back in. We won't look at all of 182 requirements, but by default, the MyCSF tool, which we talked about, will auto-select basically 1/3 of the requirements and any of the items that might have had a corrective action plan tied to it. And we measure and it's similar to a surveillance audit in the ISO world. And assuming there's no degradation in the maturity of, the requirements, I think the maximum is 2. That's all you have to do. So it's a much easier assessment that second year versus the full 182 requirements. The R2 could be even easier. Within the tool again, MyCSF, it'll select one from each of the protection domains, and we'll talk about, we could talk about the CSF and how it's organized through, control objectives and references and the different implementation levels. But the interim assessment, you choose one from each of the 19, and that's what's presented to the user to be reassessed. And then any corrective action plans and progress towards meeting those would also be included as well.
And then we had every third year, after 3 years, you're coming back and you're doing the full
assessment.
Mirrors a lot of the other frameworks like ISO 27001 as an example.
Yeah, and by that time, there's usually been a couple changes, since the CSF is updated annually. When you go through major revisions, there's a big one. I've done a lot of, version 9 to version 11, gap analysis and readiness assessments to make sure that organizations are prepared. Version 11 is a lot more streamlined. And it's also nice that now each of those requirements, whether it's the E1, the I1, or the R2, the requirements are nested. So if you start with the 44 with the E1, those 44 are going to be included inside the I1. And those 182 from the I1 are also going to be included within an R2 assessment. The R2 assessments range from, with most factors that you would select within the MyCSF tool, they have high 200s to, for a level 1 or a smaller risk organization, all the way up into, 600 or even more, depending on regulatory factors. And that's also something to talk about with the R2, because it's risk-based. The name R, or the letter R stands for risk, and 2 stands for 2 year. The risk-based nature of that is the different system factors that an organization would select. And it's usually around how much data they have, or what could be, what would be relevant in terms of, a breach and the risk to that organization. So if we're looking at a typical database, the number of records that are held, less than 10 million would usually be a level 1, 10 to 60 million would be a level 2, and then over 60 million would be a level 3. Those level 3s are, hit the high 500s. And then if you want to show compliance with any regulatory factors, such as, HIPAA or PCI DSS, or, really, there's probably, I don't know, have the exact number, but there's well over 30 different regulatory factors you could include within that, which may add more requirements to the assessment.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it sort of becomes like sort of a bit of a framework or frameworks.
Yeah, correct. And within the MyCSF tool, you can see how each of those requirements are then mapped back to a relevant authoritative source. So if you're bringing in your program and you're subject to CMS or GDPR or, Massachusetts data protection, you can see how all those requirements are mapped back and ensure, and then you can get insights reports to a lot of those as well to show your compliance with those.
Yeah, gotcha. And it's always interesting to me how the different frameworks organize these groups of requirements, into different domains. How does High Trust do that?
Yeah, so the CSF is it's it starts with control objectives or control. There's objectives, references, and then the requirement statements based upon the implementation level. So it's a little confusing, and we don't have to go through all of that. But overall, they take those requirements and they put them into 19 domains. A domain might be endpoint security. It could be risk management, vulnerability management, business continuity. Each of those 19 domains will have a subset of requirement statements. Each of those domains also need to hit a maturity or a scoring that would allow it to have certification. And that's important because a lot of frameworks, let's say PCI DSS, it's either in place or it's not in place. With HITRUST, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to hit the minimum requirement for each of those domains to result in certification. Or if you're doing an internal assessment, you could choose where to focus your remediation efforts or improvement on. So it's useful in that regard, since it's not, you don't have to be, 100% out of the gate. And I would say the majority of our assessments, we do at least have a handful of individual requirements that may not hit 100% maturity. And that maturity could be implementing a control consistently across the organization. Let's say that one of the requirements is you have encryption on your laptops. Well, if you have some that don't, but the majority do, you might score, say, 75% on the implementation. That's not going to completely cause that domain that it's tied to fail, which is nice. With the E1, there's less requirements, so there's less, the ability to average becomes a little bit more difficult. Some of the domains only have one, so if it's not in place, then that's bigger. Whereas you look at, say, access control, which has a minimum of 10 in the E1, well, that might be a little bit, an opportunity for improvement that you could correct as on an ongoing basis versus putting the entire assessment itself at risk.
Yeah, we actually have a client that's going through E1 right now, and that's exactly the problem that they're having.
Mhm.
Is that it was one of the domains that only had like two controls, and they had a small blip in the monitoring of certain systems, but it's enough to kind of put them in a difficult spot to be able to pass, because because the lack of that one control is causing the problem. So the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
The biggest one I see is when organizations don't have wireless, right? So that's, I think it's domain 5. So all of domain 5 is usually not applicable, except for that control for monitoring for unauthorized aspects. So the requirement might be to monitor for document all approved wireless access points. But there's also a part on the tail end of that requirement that says, and then monitor for unauthorized. A lot of people that do their own readiness assessments, and they come to us and say, hey, yep, we're ready, and this is not applicable. We point at that one, and then it kind of derails the efforts, because one of the concepts of HITRUST is implementation maturity in terms of the time. And for anything to be implemented before the assessor can review it, has to be 90 days. So they can't make a change during the assessment. As we're going through it, we note the gap, they fix it during the assessment, and then we can't score that because it has to have been in place for at least 90 days, or 60 for policy and procedure on an R2. So that's why readiness assessments are extremely valuable, to make sure that the organization is set up for success and that they're not going to get those gotchas with the maturity scoring when it comes down to the higher risk domains.
Yeah, that's it. So now you're kind of delving into the next topic I wanted to chat about, which is like pros and cons of the different frameworks, right? You're somebody who's sitting there and you have choices of, I can go get certified to one of these frameworks, which is the right one for me, which gets interesting. One of those things is what you just said, is that, some frameworks are a little bit more forgiving. It's kind of the nature of the framework, like ISO in that particular case.
Sure.
You'd have a non-conformity that you could correct and you'd be okay. Within HITRUST, they don't give you that latitude. SOC 2 kind of somewhere, SOC 2, well, okay, you don't have to have it, but there is an exception noted in your report. So again, interesting differences between them. So talk a little bit about that, right? So what's your thought process? Because you guys in Legacy Markham Raz, now CBiz, you do SOC 2, you do ISO 27001, you do HITRUST, you do PCI, you do ISO for 27701, you do a lot of frameworks. Like, how do you view the different frameworks and sort of the pros and cons, and and how would you guide somebody who's kind of looking at the three of them going, hey, which one should I do?
This one will surely light up the comments if this gets shared. So each one has their benefit, right? So, we're a CPA firm at heart. So the SOC 2, it's got a defined period if we're doing a type 2 examination. So you get that level of assurance for that given period, say typically a year. But not all SOC 2s are equal. And SOC 2s from within the firm, or the controls that are presented by the service organization, or even between firms, and the quality that goes into those. So I like SOC 2s for the flexibility. However, consistency is tough there. We're an ISO certification body as well. We undergo office visits each year and witness audits by our accreditation body, to make sure that that we're doing our quality management standards are being performed. PCI, there's a process that we go through with the PCI Council to make sure that they look at some of our reports on compliance and measure that. HITRUST is unique because every single assessment that we perform or validate goes to HITRUST for the certification decision, and they do their own QA, and they look and they place a really high focus on quality and consistency. I think it was mid last year they launched or released their assessor handbook to make sure that every third-party assessor organization was operating by the same rules and had clear guidance on how to do. And that's been fantastic, so that we're able to make sure that we can compete on a level playing field. With ISO as well, there's different organizations, and the sampling methodology could be different there, and the amount of work and quality there. So and with the ISO, you almost have to request the statement of applicability. Otherwise, you don't really know what controls were marked in place or not in place. The certificate itself just doesn't provide that level of assurance. But it has all of them have their benefits and their needs. And, one of the things that HITRUST later on is working towards is reciprocity. So we could talk about that, maybe in the future where they're going. But I think the unique difference is that they are the certification body, and every assessment goes through them. However, each of like I mentioned, that 90-day window, the assessor doesn't have to look back the entire year. So if an organization wants assurance for that given period of time, well, then the SOC might be a better fit. Same goes for ISO and PCI as well. So each of them have their benefits. It's confusing to say the least. And it really goes down, what I, advise clients on is speak to your clients, ask them, what would, provide the assurance that they need. A lot of times they're unfortunately checking a box and saying, hey, you need an ISO certificate, or you need a PCI report on compliance, or you have to have a HITRUST certification. And even now, those vendor agreements that come into place, those take years to go through legal. It says HITRUST certification. And well, I tell them about the E1 or the I1, and they're like, well, I don't know, I want to do the R2. I'm like, well, it says HITRUST certification. Obviously, you're going to want to ask for permission rather than forgiveness, but the E1 is HITRUST certification, and the I1 is as well. Now, you want to, be careful with that, but as long as you're showing improvement, most, clients that they're working with, they just want to see, the organizations that they're working with improve on a consistent basis, and, the HITRUST and CSF allows and affords those opportunities.
Yeah, it is, and there's a couple of things which are interesting to me about HITRUST. First, that the move away from being, used to be the Healthcare Information Alliance, whatever it was, but it was very healthcare centric. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting. They moved away from that. I think it makes sense. They were, they were developing, they were having a hard time really gaining a super amount of traction, right? It was the five major, healthcare companies, the United CSCs and Anthems were really the ones really pushing hard for it.
Hmm.
And they had built a program that didn't necessarily have to apply just to healthcare, so almost self-restrictive. So it's interesting that they moved in that direction. You really, in a weird way, I'm wrestling with it as well. Now that we're seeing more and more HITRUST out there, it feels a little bit like especially if you go R2, it feels like a combination of ISO and SOC, right? Because you've got what I like about ISO personally. I'm an ISO fan. Is ISO, I believe, has some superiority because it's got that management system component, really, and and it also lends some benefit because the audits can be focused on the management system and not the controls, which allows them to quote unquote provide a similar or better value at a lower cost point, right? Then
Hmm.
you had SOC 2, which doesn't have the management system. Okay, so you have to beat the hell out of the controls, right? So now you got a $45,000 audit instead of a $20,000 audit. It's every year, and now you look at HITRUST, and it seems to be like, well, now we have the management system component. We've got the beat the hell out of the controls like we do in a SOC 2, and we have the cost that is probably comparable to doing both of them at the same time, right? It's an expensive attestation, but
It is.
I think you could argue that because of how prescriptive it is to an extent, and to how um, uh, uh, diligent it is, that it's a pretty damn if you're R2 certified, you have to have a damn good cybersecurity program, a better cybersecurity program than it would take to either be SOC 2 attested with no exceptions noted or an ISO 27001 certified program.
100%. And, HITRUST was originally built upon ISO, and it aimed to bring the consistency with the implementation, with the prescriptiveness, with those requirements on a risk-based model. So I 100% agree. And, a lot of my guys, when we go through and do these, if they've never worked on a HITRUST assessment, they're floored about the level of detail and all the elements that need to be tested. But it really brings consistency, and I think it brings, adoption within the the industry. And for long times, it was very difficult. The only path was what is now known as the R2, and with the E1 and I1, it's made it a little bit, more attainable. And the adoption has certainly grown. And I still see people, staying with the E1, even though it's only been out for about 2 years at this point. Um, I, I think I was told I was the first one to submit an E1 for certification in the April of 2023. But we've seen people move up to the I1, people that start with the I1 and do an R2 readiness and then say, oh, we can't do this. This is a 2026 or 7, initiative now, because it is very detailed and it is very difficult. And they're making the R2 the gold standard. And especially for large organizations who might have a lot of data or risk, to their program. And, some of those requirements, are very detailed, and it can be very time consuming.
And from that perspective, what do you like? I think it was interesting, and I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing more of it right now is we have this entry level pathway in, right? And I think in a weird way too, if you look at ISO or SOC 2, the E1 is a little bit easier, right? Because like you said, it's 44 controls. Now you do hold people's feet to the fire a bit for the 44
Sure.
controls, but it is kind of a nice entry level way of saying, hey, I have something, right? I have some level of certification. What are you seeing? Are you seeing right, it used to just be, full. What are you seeing in distribution of people coming in? Are you seeing the people that were R2 who originally were part of HITRUST are just staying up there in that R2 world? Are people coming in usually at the E1 or I1 level? Do you see people still coming in R2? Is it based on what they're being asked for by their clients? What are you seeing?
Yes, I don't know if I actually completed my thought there on the previous question, but the vendor agreements, which say just HITRUST certification, and they're asking that, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of organizations have started with the E1 or the I1, and I would say well over 50% of the new clients we've started working with in the last couple of years have gone that route. Um, I've had some previous, not as many, R2 clients that have reverted to an I1 because their clients they had the conversation with their clients. Their clients have accepted that. They were relatively low risk, but they were told they had to have HITRUST certification, and the cost of operating, an R2, compliant information management program just wasn't there for the, the value of the client that was requesting it. But by and large, well over half, if not, maybe even up to 65, 70% of the new clients are starting with the E1 and I1 path because it's more attainable. And since it's nested, everything they do on those E1 with those 44 requirements or 182 for the I1, they're reusable. So they just, as they have time, budgets are pretty strained nowadays, and, clients are looking to meet their customers' needs, and with changing staff and resources. So it's made it, a lot easier to maintain on an ongoing basis, and certainly for the adoption for the first time.
Yeah. So obviously there's a cost to implement, there's a cost to certify, and there's a cost to maintain. And if you start with at that lower end of the scale, right, all three of those are going to be low, right? Because there's an operational effect, an impact on effectiveness and efficiency of operation to run additional controls, basically, right?
Yep. I have a client that has, for part of their business units, they have a current R2 they've been doing for, I think this is probably their second, maybe even third certification cycle. Another firm does that, but we do their SOC reports. So now we're going to be doing, many more of their products for another client that's requested it, and they're in conversations with that client. Hey, can we start with the I1 for this? Because this is going to be a level 3, and I think originally they needed it by March of 26, and had some very frank conversations like, I don't think that this is attainable, but let's start the path to getting you there from a readiness perspective, as well as having you have the conversation with internal business as well as with the clients, and setting a path for success to make this achievable. Otherwise, it's going to be a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah, we're having an interesting conversation with one of our clients right now. Is that they were ISO 27001 and SOC 2. Now they're being asked for HITRUST. Now they're going E1. But they're asking me, and I'm like, look, guys, we it doesn't make any sense to maintain all three of these, right? I mean, we got to go back to clients. I know you have 3 different client contracts, and this one says ISO, this one says SOC, this one says HITRUST. But at some point, we got to go back and sit down and let somebody say, no, right? This doesn't make sense. We have 3 certifications that are telling you the same thing. Let's pick the high water mark, or pick, in their particular case, I'm thinking personally, keep the ISO and keep the HITRUST, because I think SOC 2 is closer to HITRUST with the extent and rigor of the controls. And I think ISO has some benefits from an extensibility perspective. They're dealing with private information. So ISO 27701 is a nice bolt on. Yep. And then they also do a lot of AI work. So 42001. So if we kind of stack that over here, and we say, hey, from a management system extensive, we got all of this covered. And then from a HITRUST perspective, you got that deep extent, rigor, and validation that things are operating the way they are intended. That seems like a pretty damn good combination to be able to hand somebody. If at that point somebody wants more, I don't know if it's worth it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, writing a SOC report, from depending on how the HITRUST assessment was completed, and we complete all of our assessments, in the manner with the the timing that we could write a type 2 report from it. So since it, taking a report, taking the testing and the requirements and wrapping that into a SOC 2, and maybe not even a SOC 2 plus. But that's usually if for those clients that just have to have a SOC report,
low cost option.
Yeah, it's going to be a fraction of.
That's a pretty cool approach.
Yeah, and HITRUST has their new AI they launched last fall, which really draws on NIST and ISO. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're the ISO, but I think it's 23862.
Yeah, it's a weird number. That's the one that supports 42001.
Exactly.
It's where all the yeah. I think it's 23889. I don't remember.
But you can layer that in to any HITRUST assessment and get that report separately. So let's say that you do that, and for some reason, whatever AI, and it's for service providers, not necessarily for for usage. but it doesn't affect the certification itself, the base certification, which is useful. So I'm interested to see how, HITRUST, their AI security assessments align with 42001, as I know we're also looking to become accredited for 40001 as well.
And roughly in ballpark, right, ranges, right? Like E1 audits range between X and Y, wide ranges are fine, versus I1 versus R2, just to give people who are listening like at least some semblance of an understanding.
Yeah. So, I would say E1 assessments are for most organizations, scope obviously matters, and they could have 100 locations and huge systems, but let's say E1 is on the $10,000 to $20,000 range. It's 44 requirements. If they've gone through this before, it should be rather easy to get through that assessment. They give you 90 days to complete every assessment by HITRUST assessment guidelines, but most E1s should be completed within a few weeks. I1s, I'd say in the, let's say, 30 to 50 range. I mean, there's 182 requirements there, and if it's the organization's first time, it might take a little time for them to understand how to provide the evidence and what's going to be requested. And R2s, I would say those probably start in the 60 all the way up until the low six figures, depending on scope and risk factors or implementation level required.
Yeah, so you can see that there's quite a wide range, and there's a lot of benefit. Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. So you sort of alluded a little bit. Where does HITRUST go from here? You said it's going to be interesting to see what they do from an AI perspective. What else are you thinking about, like where HITRUST is going? And yeah,
so that challenge that you posed about having to do 3 different reports, right? In the old days, I think I had one client, and I say that now, but it's probably been 6-7 years ago. We had a client that did HITRUST, PCI, SOC, and then they were exploring ISO. And I don't think we were a certification body at that time, but if they were, we would have done it as well. And that's a lot to manage, both from an assessment standpoint, because we're pretty good at combining, provide once, report many. But the logistics and aligning periods and how quality management standards and how assessments need to be completed to reuse that testing and that evidence can be very challenging and expensive to the clients. If the HITRUST assessment is on a different period than their SOC 2, they're essentially going through 2 audits a year. That's challenging from an internal resource perspective. It's costly from an external assessment cost. So they're really working on reciprocity. I know that they've got state ramp. I know they're working with some other regulatory bodies to get the HITRUST CSF and validated reports, whether that's most likely going to be R2, to be accepted in lieu of another type of assessment. Their success on that, we'll see. But I know that that's a key focus with some of the working groups within the HITRUST Assessor Council, which I'm part of. So that would be very valuable if you could say, here you go, you guys should accept this. But it really comes down to educating their clients. And unfortunately, the third-party risk management person on the other end, they might just be checking a box that says this vendor has this report and they're good to go, rather than really looking at the risk and the value, whether it was a SOC report or ISO or PCI DSS or HITRUST certification. So that's going to take some education, but I think we're going to get there because people are going to start pushing back. And I think HITRUST is in a pretty good place with the consistency across the industry, being the certification body. ISO as well. Each one of them has their benefits. I know what the target market they're selling into and what. But somebody's got to do something because it's a whole lot for every organization, especially smaller ones.
Yeah, well, yeah, and we hadn't touched on prior to this, right? But you just started touching on state ramp, which touches on Fed ramp, and then you've got, of course, CMMC. So now, like we have another problem, right? That the government, the U.S. government, has a different set of standards than than business, the commercial side of the house does, right? So that would be an interesting approach. Is because I think that CMMC is the NIST 800-171 guidance is a pretty solid set of guidance, right? It's a fairly robust program. little too focused on confidentiality because it was a derivation of some of the 853 stuff specific to confidentiality. But
Yeah.
it's still a pretty damn good little program. And you could argue that if you've got a CMMC and now you have and you're handing that to your defense industrial base clients, and now somebody on the other side says, I want ISO 27001, and we have a lot of clients that have both, like, kind of be nice if you could say, well, isn't my CMMC good enough? Right now, what you're saying is the same thing. Like, okay, hey, now you want state ramp or you want Fed ramp and you want CMMC, but I've already got HITRUST. It's the same damn controls, just framed a little bit different. Isn't there a way that we could get to a point of reciprocity? Somebody's going to win the reciprocity battle, and when they do, everyone's life's going to be easier, and there's going to be some big winners and some big losers.
I agree. And HITRUST, with using all those different authoritative sources and mapping them in, they're kind of well poised to show the value because the requirement, the implementation guidance or the illustrated procedures are largely pulled from 853. The program as a whole is, it's kind of centered around ISO. I know that with the R2 assessments, assuming you meet the maturity, you get a NIST CSF, HITRUST certification for that as well, letters showing that. But I think CMMC would probably be the biggest opportunity for them to make inroads into, because once that finally gets launched and people start requiring and going through those, I think that's going to be the biggest win if it's the market is there, which every government subcontractor and then those service providers that they use are going to have to be required to have that. So we'll see, but there's got to do something, because having clients pay for 4 different assessments
makes no sense.
It just doesn't make any sense when they're all kind of saying the same thing in maybe a different manner.
I agree. And CMMC, the opportunity there is huge just when you think about the DIB. And if you look at the CUI registry, right, at NARA, like the DIB data is 1/19th or 1/20th of that, right? Like, so every other agency that, ultimately, especially with the way the lawmaking takes place, it's likely that they're going to look at this and go, well, we're giving other people CUI. Why should our CUI get less? Well, let's ask them for 80171 CMMC. So, I mean, you could be at a point where 5 or 10 years from now, like virtually anyone that's doing business with the government exchanging student information, intellectual property, stuff around court, stuff around student information, all that information, FERPA type stuff, all gets covered by CMMC. And at that point, like, now everyone's got that and everyone has something to deal with their commercial clients. It's kind of a win-lose situation, right?
Yeah, it should be interested to see how that plays out. And I know that that's on our roadmap to join, and I think we are starting the FedRAMP, third-party assessor process. I think we just submitted that, so we're looking to have that hopefully next year.
All right. Well,
CMMC shortly after.
Yeah, it's gonna be a fascinating next 5 to 10 years, on your side of the equation, on the attest side. Of course, that forces what we do on our side, which is to get people ready for attest. So yeah, it's gonna be a fascinating 5-year period. I think we beat this up pretty good. Did we miss anything?
I don't think so. We can go. I can speak for hours in the details there. I've been doing this for a while, and but from a high level, I think HITRUST is great because it builds the consistency. It's now scalable from the smaller organizations to the larger one, where previously it wasn't. So that's been great for adoption and building the brand and the making sure that clients and the vendors are able to achieve this and meet those contractual obligations from sales enablement and ongoing risk management process as well.
Yeah, I think the secret for, if you're HITRUST or you're somebody who's an advocate of HITRUST is going to be, does it become, like, if you look at most third-party risk management programs, they'll usually say something like, are you ISO certified, SOC 2 attested, or equivalent, right? If they got HITRUST added to that statement, right, I think it gives them a little bit more, would give them a little more juice, you know what I mean? Because right now, I think people go to I think, look, the vast majority of people who get any one of these types of certifications get it because someone tells them they have to.
Of course. Or right. they feel that they need it to be competitive in the marketplace.
Right.
Yeah. I think United Health Group in 2016 had a clause in their standard agreement that said SOC 2 with, current HITRUST self-assessment within 90 days, a validated assessment, and after, I think it was 18 months, and then certification in 24. So we'll see how that goes. But reciprocity is going to be key, making it attainable so that organizations are able to compete on a level playing field, so that they don't have to go through all of these assessments, especially for the smaller ones. It's very burdensome.
Yep. If someone wants to get in contact with you, what's the easiest way to do that?
Yeah, so you can send me, let's see, LinkedIn. We can post this after the fact here, but it's linkedin.com/CP Schaeffer, Schaffver 1, the number 1. And either that or Christopher.Schaeffer, Schaffver @cbiz.com.
Sounds good, man. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, John. Bye-bye.